In 2017, following the death of her grandfather, June Harper, a 31-year-old illustrator from Santa Fe, New Mexico, inherited the old family house on the outskirts of town. The property had stood there for nearly a century, weathered and silent, a two-story adobe structure that seemed to repel time as much as it absorbed it. June hadn't set foot in it for years. She had avoided it with the kind of instinctual resistance usually reserved for places that once betrayed her. Childhood memories clung to its walls like mildew, not just moments of confusion and loneliness, but those quiet humiliations that only family could manufacture. The house had a history, but more than that, it had a voice, and no one had ever believed her when she said she could hear it. Her return was slow, deliberate. The legal paperwork had arrived in a thick envelope 2 weeks after the funeral, signed and notarized. Her grandfather had left the house to her alone, bypassing her parents entirely. That fact alone raised questions she didn't dare ask out loud. When she arrived, it was mid-morning in early autumn. The desert light was harsh, and the air carried that dry, electric stillness that came after a monsoon. Yet inside the house, it was cool and dim. Too dim. The curtains were half drawn, the air heavy with the faint scent of soap that didn't belong to anyone she remembered. The kind of artificial citrus that came from hotel bathrooms or borrowed showers. Dust blanketed most surfaces, but on the mirror in the upstairs hallway, a long vertical streak stood out. A finger had been dragged across it recently. June stood in silence, studying it, her mind cataloging its curvature, the faint ripple at the edge. It was fresh. She checked the windows. All were locked. The back door had a chain. And yet someone had been inside. Someone who hadn't been her. In the kitchen, the old enamel stove had a single mug beside it. Dry, but not dusty. As if it had been used and carefully placed back in its exact old position. She didn't tell anyone she had already moved in. Instead, she called her family under the guise of needing help sorting through the attic, clearing out furniture, preparing the property for sale. She said all the right things, that it was time to let go, that they could donate the old clothes and photographs, maybe even list the house by the new year. Her mother hesitated. Her father sounded distant. Her sister agreed immediately. They all said they would come. What she didn't tell them was that she had already started cataloging every item in the house, every letter, every drawer, every locked cabinet. That she had found a small notebook beneath the floorboards in her grandfather's room, pages filled with incoherent phrases, repeating names, and one sentence underlined 4 times. They think I don't remember, but the house remembers everything. What she didn't say was that she was documenting not only objects, but sensations. The cold spots in the hallway, the ticking sound that came from the walls at precisely 2:19 a.m., the way the bathroom light flickered in a rhythmic pattern she began to suspect was intentional. She had returned to inherit, but not the house, not the land. June had returned to inherit the silence that had buried her grandfather, and to see what happened when it was broken. The first few days unfolded with an eerie calm. June's parents settled into the master bedroom downstairs, the same room where her grandfather had spent his final weeks. Her sister took the small room across the hall, still painted in the pale green of their childhood, with faded cartoon stickers peeling at the edges of the closet door. June chose the attic. It had once been a storage space, cluttered with boxes and forgotten furniture, but she cleared a path and laid out her sleeping bag near the circular window. It was the place she remembered most vividly, the place where, at 6 years old, she had first seen the dark shape standing beyond the glass, tall, still, and watching. Her mother had told her she was dreaming. June remembered believing her. Now she remembered choosing to believe her. Each morning was ordinary. They made coffee. Her father read the paper on his tablet. Her mother reorganized kitchen drawers. Her sister took long walks through the neighborhood, as if trying to reclaim something familiar in the landscape. June watched them with the quiet detachment of an archivist, cataloging gestures, silences, and the faint tension that never quite left the room when they were together. It began with the clock. In the hallway just outside the attic stairs stood an old grandfather clock, a relic from the 1950s that had been broken for as long as June could remember. Its hands had been stuck at 2:10 for decades. On the second evening, she passed it on her way downstairs and noticed the pendulum swinging gently. The hands now pointed to 4:44. She thought it was a mistake, but when she came back 2 hours later, the pendulum had stopped again, the hands still frozen at the same time. The next morning, the same pattern repeated. She didn't mention it. 2 days later, her sister found a small, yellowed slip of paper beneath the armchair in the guest room. It had been carefully folded, aged and delicate. On it, in a trembled hand, was written, "You knew I wasn't insane." No punctuation, no date, no signature. Her sister confronted June, voice tinged with anger and suspicion. She accused her of staging things, of turning their return into some twisted performance art. June didn't argue. She only asked where the note had been found. Her parents said nothing. That night, June placed a small microphone beneath the floorboards near the kitchen, the place her grandfather had always said the walls creaked even when no one walked. She set up a reel-to-reel tape recorder in the attic and let it run through the night. When she played it back in the morning, she heard faint footsteps pacing slowly, precisely, back and forth, though everyone had been asleep. On another recording, she heard a low, rhythmic knocking, not like plumbing or pipes, but deliberate, mechanical, always at the same intervals. She began logging the events in a leather-bound journal. Each sound had a time code. Each shadow had a location. She traced patterns on floor plans, marked the temperature variations near the windows, and noted which lights flickered and when. The house wasn't haunted, not in the traditional sense. It was repeating something, like a wound that never fully closed. Every corner of the house held some piece of the story that had been cut away, scrubbed from memory, denied into silence. Old family photos bore faint outlines of people who had been removed. A dusty bookshelf in the dining room revealed, behind its backing panel, a stack of unopened letters addressed to her grandfather in handwriting that wasn't familiar. Each one postmarked decades ago. Each one returned, unopened. June no longer trusted her childhood memories, but she trusted the patterns now. Something had been buried here. Not a body, but a truth. And the house was trying, in its own fractured way, to speak it again. The lights went out just after 8 p.m. The entire house fell into a thick, sudden silence, broken only by the shuffle of feet and the instinctive reach for flashlights and phones. June stood perfectly still in the hallway, one hand on the banister, already anticipating what her father would say from the living room below. He blamed the wiring, muttering about the age of the house, about how the circuit box had probably never been updated since the 70s. But June knew better. She had switched out the hallway bulbs for battery-powered decoys 2 days earlier. This blackout wasn't an accident. It was a scene. Later that night, the light from the chandelier in the dining room flickered to life on its own. The rest of the house remained dark, but the single circle of light hung like a spotlight, casting long, trembling shadows across the floorboards. Directly beneath it hung the oil portrait of her grandfather. Solemn, unsmiling, eyes always too direct for comfort. Her mother stood at the threshold, unnerved. She asked if June had turned it on. But June merely pointed to the wall, where the switch had been broken for years, the wiring disconnected and stuffed deep inside the plaster. She was no longer just observing the house. She was designing it. June had begun to manipulate the environment in small, calculated doses. The goal was not fear, not exactly. It was erosion, the steady breakdown of certainty, of memory, of comfort. In the music room, she rigged a small transducer to the underside of the old upright piano. It activated only between 2 crayons and 2:10 a.m., releasing a single low chord into the room. The lid of the piano remained closed, but the sound was unmistakable, like fingers pressing ghostly keys in the dark. She installed a night vision camera in the kitchen, mounted behind the upper cabinet molding. The footage it captured showed something deeply unsettling. At 3:13 a.m., on the second night of recording, the gas burner knobs on the stove began to move, not with visible force, but with a gentle click-click motion. The flames never lit, but the hiss of gas could be heard on the audio track, faint and steady. In the morning, the kitchen reeked of something metallic and sour. Her father opened a window. Her mother didn't speak. The atmosphere in the house thickened by the day. Her mother began drinking wine earlier and more often. Small glasses at lunch turned into full bottles by dinner. Her sister grew withdrawn, twitchy. She spent long hours in her childhood room with the door closed, headphones on, lights off. When June passed by, she sometimes heard her talking to someone, no one she recognized. Then the drawings started appearing. In the hallway closet, tucked between folded linens, her sister discovered a series of old papers, crayon sketches from their childhood. At least they looked like that at first. But these drawings weren't innocent. They depicted dark corridors, faceless people, staircases that curved into impossible angles. On one of them, written in a looping, childlike scrawl, were the words, "I hear him under the steps." Her sister brought them to June, accusing her again of staging it all. June only looked at the paper, not bothering to deny anything anymore. Some truths didn't need defense. The final layer was the projection. She had carefully hidden the portable projector inside a hollowed-out bookshelf in the hallway. Each night, she programmed it to cast a shadow, a tall, still silhouette, against the plaster wall just beyond the staircase. The figure shifted position every night, imperceptibly closer to the first step, like something crawling forward in silence. The light was subtle, not sharp enough to notice unless one looked directly. But once seen, it was impossible to forget. The house began to breathe differently. Every door creaked as if reluctant. Every floorboard felt like it had weight beneath it. June watched as her family moved through it, no longer with casual presence, but with tight shoulders and glances over their shoulders. They were beginning to feel what she had felt all those years ago. Not fear of the house, but fear that the house remembered them, that it knew what they had chosen to forget. On the fourth night, something finally cracked. The tension in the house had stretched so taut it no longer vibrated. It hummed, low and constant, like a wire pulled to the brink. June sat cross-legged in the attic with her headphones on, eyes closed, listening to the room breathe around her. The air was thick with dust and heat, but beneath that, she could hear what she had been waiting for. A shift in footsteps, a sudden intake of breath. Then, below her, the sound of the stairs groaning under the weight of someone climbing. Her father's voice erupted like a wound tearing open. From the attic doorway, his words exploded into the air with startling clarity. He shouted into the dark, his voice cracked and ragged, as if he wasn't speaking to someone present, but to something he'd been carrying for decades. There was no answer. The attic remained still, but his voice echoed down through the walls, into the floorboards, through every inch of wood and dust. Downstairs, her mother shut herself in the bathroom. The door clicked shut with a soft finality, and the sink began to run endlessly, covering the sounds outside. She didn't emerge for over an hour. When she did, her hands trembled as she clutched a towel, her gaze unfocused. June had already set up microphones across the house, one beneath the dining table, another behind the air vent in the hallway, and the most sensitive one just beneath the attic floorboards. Every word was captured, every confession preserved. Her sister heard it too. She came into June's room sometime after midnight, barefoot, pale, asking if she'd heard what their father said. June, without turning, said only that he was probably overtired. Her tone was flat. But in truth, she knew exactly what had triggered the outburst. It had nothing to do with ghosts or superstition. It was guilt, and it had a history. In a locked box in the basement, June had found the cassette tape. It was unmarked, dusty, nearly brittle from age. She borrowed an old player from a neighbor down the road, claiming she was working on a sound design project. That night, she brought the player into the basement and pressed play. The tape crackled to life with the scratchy background hum of old recordings. Then a voice, her grandfather's, emerged, slow and deliberate. He sounded tired, his speech uneven, like someone who had rehearsed the words 100 times in silence before daring to say them aloud. He spoke of 1989, of how, during a period of failing health and depression, he had been convinced to sign over the property to his son-in-law. There had been promises that he would be cared for, that the house would be maintained, cherished, that nothing would change. But within months, he had been moved to a facility, not a care home, a psychiatric clinic, and no one had come to visit. His voice on the tape faltered, cracked, then rose again, not in anger, but in something colder, betrayal sharpened by clarity. He described the things they told others, that he was losing his memory, that he had become paranoid, that the house was no longer safe with him in it. But in the final moments of the recording, his voice changed. It became steadier. He spoke directly, no longer to the machine, but to June. He said he hoped one day someone would hear this, that the house had seen it all, that memory lived in the bones of things. When the tape ended, June sat in silence. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She rewound it and played it again, then again. She let the voice sink into the walls, into the wires, into the spaces between the silence. Later that evening, she connected the player to the house's central vent system and set it to broadcast the tape throughout the ductwork, faint enough to feel like memory, not sound. She didn't want justice. She wanted presence. She wanted them to remember the truth not as a revelation, but as a haunting, something they'd buried and now could no longer escape. The door was discovered by accident. They were all in the attic, sorting through old boxes and trying to decide what to discard, when her father leaned against the far wall and something clicked. A panel shifted, not dramatically, just enough to suggest that the wall was not what it seemed. Behind it, half obscured by insulation and wooden beams, was a narrow door. None of them remembered it being there. Not June, not her sister, not even her mother, who had spent entire summers in this house as a girl. Her father stared at it for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether it had appeared or always existed. The door opened without resistance. It revealed a small square room, no more than 8 feet across, completely empty except for a single rocking chair and an old television set with a thick glass screen. The walls were painted a sterile, almost blinding white. No artwork, no curtains, no dust. It looked untouched by time and emotion, a space carved out of silence. There were no signs of when it had last been entered or used. The light inside was dim, but not dark. No switch, no bulb, yet the room glowed faintly, as if lit from within. No one wanted to step inside. Her mother stood frozen in the doorway, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her sister turned away, muttering something under her breath. Her father knelt briefly, inspecting the floorboards, as if they might offer an explanation. June said nothing. She simply walked away, returned a few minutes later with a framed childhood photograph of her sister, a school portrait from 2nd grade, wide smile and missing teeth. Without speaking, she placed it gently on the seat of the rocking chair, then closed the door. That night, her sister lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed into the skull. Around 3 a.m., she heard the creak of the attic floor above her, followed by a sound she had not heard in years. Her name, spoken once, then again, slowly, in their grandfather's voice. By sunrise, she was gone. Packed bags, car keys, a hastily written note left on the kitchen table. No forwarding address, no explanations. Their mother broke down not long after. She screamed at June in the kitchen, accusing her of ruining everything, of planting ideas, of poisoning memories that were better left untouched. Her rage built like a storm, wild and directionless. Then, without warning, she struck June across the face. The sound echoed louder than it should have. A line had been crossed, and even her mother knew it. June didn't flinch. She walked into the living room, opened the sideboard drawer, and removed a sealed envelope. Inside was the original version of the will, not the copy that had been filed, but the one her grandfather had written by hand. It contained the usual bequests: the house, a list of belongings. But near the end, in a different ink, there was a final sentence. They made sure I disappeared. Beneath it was a signature. Below that, a single dark fingerprint. It was impossible to tell if it was ink or something else. June handed it to her mother and watched her read it. She said nothing. Her silence was no longer passive. It was indictment. The house didn't need to explain itself anymore. It had been telling the truth all along. A month later, the house stood quiet. The garden had overgrown slightly, vines beginning to reclaim the porch railing. The shutters creaked in the wind, and the mailbox remained empty. Her parents hadn't returned. Her sister had sent a letter, handwritten, soft in tone, filled with apologies and half-formed memories, but June never opened it. The envelope sat unopened on the mantel, gathering dust like everything else that no longer mattered. June stayed. She didn't leave the house, not even once. She ate in silence, moved from room to room like a caretaker, with no one to care for. But she wasn't idle. The silence had become her medium. She began assembling the pieces: images, sounds, fragments. She curated every object with forensic precision, placing each item exactly where it would hurt the most. A childhood photograph, torn and reassembled with red thread. A collection of whispered confessions layered onto cassette tapes. A chair placed just a few degrees off center, as if someone had left in a rush and never returned. She called it reconstruction of the forgotten. The house became a gallery. In every room, she installed speakers that played loops of recorded voices. Not loud, never clear, but just present enough to stir the memory. Her grandfather's letters were rewritten in invisible ink that glowed under blacklight. A hallway was covered in old prescriptions and clinic documents, arranged like wallpaper. In the upstairs bedroom, she placed a bed with sheets soaked in a faint scent of antiseptic and rainwater. Visitors said it smelled like a hospital at night. The exhibition opened quietly. A few local journalists arrived, then word spread. Artists came, followed by curators, followed by strangers. They walked through the house with solemn faces, eyes wide, unsure where the line was between real and constructed. The critics described it as suffocating, claustrophobic. One reviewer called it a house that mourns while indicting. Another wrote that every room vibrates with the weight of a name left unspoken. But they didn't know. They didn't know that June had invented the letters, that the audio had been layered and manipulated, that the names in the documents had been altered, blurred, reshuffled, that the red thread was new, that the photographs were staged, that what they were witnessing wasn't her grandfather's memory. It was hers. The installation wasn't made for the public. It was made for those who once lived there. Every item, every whispered line, every shadow cast by carefully placed light was aimed directly at her family. A blueprint of guilt, designed to reopen old wounds and keep them bleeding. Her art wasn't therapy. It wasn't reconciliation. It was the formalization of resentment. It was the architecture of vengeance. The house was no longer haunted by spirits. It was haunted by evidence, by constructed memory, by curated grief. Visitors left feeling shaken, some even disturbed. But they didn't see what June saw. They didn't see that everything in the house had been planted like seeds, not for them, but for those who once called her delusional, those who had silenced her, those who had rewritten the story to survive their own comfort. And now, when they thought of the house, they would remember what she had built. Not ghosts, not horror, but a record, a place where the truth didn't whisper anymore. It echoed, and it stayed.